Okay, let's look at game number 4
from PrepTest 93, and be sure to hit subscribe for many more explanation videos of official LSAT prep tests.
So we have a movie studio releasing 7 movies. So it looks like that's our list of variables for this logic game. Let's go ahead and start off by writing them out like we always do. H, J, K, L, M, O, P. And based on the marketing plan, the movies will be released one at a time in accordance with the following rules. So it looks like we're just putting 7 things in order, 1st through 7th. So that's good news. It's just a simple sequencing game, which we always start off like this. We have 7 blank lines, and we have 7 letters, and we have to figure out which letter goes onto which line. So let's go ahead and look at the rules. Rule number 1, J has to be earlier than H. So that we always show like this. Anytime someone has to be before someone else in a sequencing game, we use ... That's very simple. Next, P has to be later than both O and H, but earlier than L. So let's just write that out one step at a time. First of all, P has to be later than O and H. So P is later than both O and H. I always write these sort of compound rules out slowly just to make sure I don't make a mistake. So P is later than both O and H, but P is earlier than L. Okay, now we may notice that since P is after H, P also has to be after J, right? That sort of ties together with this rule, but we can't literally physically tie the whole thing together because P is also after O, so that wouldn't really combine so well with the first rule, but at least it's worth noticing. Next, K has to be released third if J is first. So that's a conditional rule, right? If J is first, we always show if-then statements with an arrow. And we're going to show this on the grid because we always like to show things on the grid whenever possible. So if the beginning of the arrow is true, then the end of the arrow is true. Then K has to be third, right? The beginning of the arrow is J, even though that's the end of the sentence, right? Even though the jujitsu is the end of the sentence, it doesn't matter. That's where the if is. So we always start if-then statements with the if, right? So if J is first, that's what triggers that rule. Then K has to be third. And then finally, another if statement, if M is earlier than P. So we'll write this down here because it doesn't have to do with any specific spots on the grid. If P is before, if M is before P, then, if that's true, then J has to be earlier than K. J has to be earlier than K, but later than M. Let's just make sure we did that right. So J would be earlier than K, and J would be later than M. So that looks right, and that's triggered if M is before P. So there we go. There's our setup. Nothing too complicated here. Let's go ahead and look at the questions. Number 18, which of the following could be the order from first to last of the movies? So this is just a simple acceptability question. We're given 5 scenarios, and we just have to figure out which one follows all the rules. So the way we always do these questions is by going through the rules one at a time and checking off all the ones that break each rule one by one. So we'll start off with the easiest rule. J has to be before H. So let's see. A, J is before H, right? J is first. B, J is not before H. If you look at B, jujitsu is after half-hearted, so B obviously breaks that rule. C, I see that J is before H. D, J is before H. And E, J is also before H. So we're done with that rule. Let's go ahead and move on to the next rule. Let's do that next sequencing rule. It's kind of a big rule, but let's try to remember. We're looking for OH and then P and then L. So A, I see OH within the first 3, and then after them I see P, and then after P I see L. So A follows that rule. We're going to skip B because we already crossed it off. C, I see OH in the middle, and then later than them, I see P, and then later than P, I see L. So C follows that rule. D, I see OH in the first 4, and then I see periwinkle, and then I see lowball later than that. So D follows that rule as well. And then finally, E, I see OH, 3rd and 4th, but then I see L, and then P is after L. So E messes up that order, and therefore E is wrong. We can go ahead and cross that off and move on to the next rule. So next we have our 2 conditional rules. Let's start with the simpler one. If J is first, K is third. So A, J is first, which means K should be third, but it's not in A, right? O is third in A. So therefore A triggers that rule, but then breaks it, so it's wrong. C, J is not first, so C doesn't break that rule because it doesn't even trigger it, so that's good. D, same thing, J is not first, so it doesn't trigger that rule, which means it doesn't break it. And then finally, our final conditional rule, if M is before P, then MJK. C, I see that M is before P, right, because M is second, and P is, sixth? So C triggers that rule, which means that in C, it should be M before J before K, but it's not, because in C, K is first, and then M is second. So C triggers that rule, but it breaks it, which means we're left with D as the right answer, right? We only had C and D left to check for that last rule, and therefore we're left with D as the right answer. Let's just look at D and see why it follows that rule. D doesn't even trigger that last rule, right? Because the rule says if M is before P, then something has to be true. But in D, M is not before P, so therefore it doesn't even trigger that rule, which means for sure it doesn't break the rule. So anyway, that's the end of number 18. Pretty straightforward question. The answer is D. Number 19, if Ollie is the fifth movie. So before we even have to finish reading the question, any question that starts with an if, it doesn't really matter what happens after the if. It doesn't matter what the answer choices say. First things first, we make the if true and we look for inferences. So if Ollie is fifth, let's look at the rules and see if we can determine anything. So we do have a rule that has Ollie in it, obviously, this rule. And that rule seems to have been triggered here because we know that O has to be before P, and we know that P has to be before L, and there are only two spots available later than O here, which means the only way to follow that rule is if we put P in sixth and then L in seventh. We are forced to do that, so that is an inference. Okay, can we figure anything else out here? Let's look at the other rules. Well, let's see, we just placed P, and that potentially triggers this rule because that rule has a P in it, so let's think about it. We know that if M is before P, then something else has to be true. So is M before P here? Well, we don't know where M is, but we certainly know that it's going to be somewhere in the first four spots, which means it's going to have to be earlier than P, which is later, right? There's no room for M to go later than P, which means for sure, regardless of wherever M goes, we are going to trigger this condition, which means that, therefore, this has to be true, right? If the beginning of the arrow is true, then the end of the arrow has to be true, which means that M has to be before J, which has to be before K, which is very convenient because that's 3 out of the 4 letters left. What's the only one missing? It seems to be H. What do we know about H? Well, we know that H has to be before P and L, which it's going to be anyway, so we don't have to worry about that. But we also know that it has to be later than J, which means we can go ahead and add the H into our chain there. We know that it's going to be M, and then somewhere later J, and then somewhere later K and H, which means we pretty much know exactly where everything goes because M is going to have to go first, J is going to have to go second, and then K and H are going to be interchangeable. So that was a very nice run of inferences there, right? Each domino triggered the next domino. So what you want to do is practice being able to see all of that really quickly, right? If you can get to the point that you can see all those inferences in 10 to 20 seconds, then you are golden, right? Those are all pretty standard inferences. All you had to do is look at the rules and see which rule was triggered by the last thing that you did and kind of just boom, 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 go in order, see all those inferences, and you're pretty much done the question now. So let's go ahead and see what's the question asking us. If Ollie is fifth, which of the following could be true? So of these 5 things, according to our diagram on the page, which one could be true? A, could H be earlier than K? Yes, it could be. It doesn't have to be, but it could be, right? It could be H is third and then K is fourth. Therefore, A is the answer. These other ones are all impossible. B, could L be earlier than K? Nope, L is last. C, could O be earlier than M? No, of course not. M is first, right? All these other answers are contradicting with what we have. D, could K be earlier than J? No, because J is second and K is either third or fourth. And finally, E, could P be earlier than M? No, because P is there and M is all the way at the beginning. So, pretty straightforward question. The answer is A. Let's look at number 20. Which of the following must be true? So the way that we test out answer choices on a must be true question, as you know, is by making them false or by attempting to make them false. And the one that we can't make false, that's how we prove that it must be true, that it's the answer. So let's start with A. Does Half-Hearted have to be one of the first 4 movies? So let's try to not make that true. Let's try to not put H in one of these first 4 slots. So we know that H does have to be before a couple of things, which means we can't shove it super late, right? We still have to leave room for that P and L. So in order to make A false, you'd have to put H here, right? You can't put it any later than 5th. So maximum is 5th, right? Because we need to leave room for P and L. So this would be the only way to even have a shot at making A false, right? If you don't want to put it in the first 4, well, the absolute latest it can go is 5th in order to be able to fit in P and L. So let's see if this works. Well, we certainly have guaranteed following of this rule because J is going to end up somewhere before H. We don't know exactly where yet, but we won't have to worry about it because no matter what, that rule is going to be followed. We have triggered this rule, right? We have constructed this in a way where M is going to end up going somewhere before P, which means we do have to concern ourselves with this. We have to make sure to put M before J before K. So let's go ahead and do that. I don't really think it matters where we put them, but let's just go ahead and throw them in. What are we missing? It seems like we followed all the rules, right? We have not triggered this rule, so that's always good. If you don't trigger a rule, then you don't have to worry about it. J is before H, and OH is going to be before P, which is before L. O is our missing letter. That's totally fine. And of course, we made sure to follow that last rule, which means A works. We just made A false, and therefore it doesn't have to be true, right? H doesn't have to be one of the first 4 because we just showed that it could be 5th. What about B? Does L have to be one of the last 3? Well, let's see. If we're going to make that false, if we're not going to put L in one of these last 3 spots, well, then we have to put L earlier than that. But we can't put L that early, right? We have to keep an eye on this rule. The maximum earliest that L could possibly be would be 4th, right? So we need to make sure that we leave enough room for O, H, and P to come before L, right? So if we're not putting L as one of the last 3, right? So we want to push L earlier than those last 3, but we can't push it any earlier than 4th. So the only chance at making B false is by putting L 4th so that we have enough room to put O and H and P before it. So P would go 3rd, and then O and H would go in those first 2. The problem is it doesn't matter which place you put O in and which place you put H in, because no matter what, we're going to have to start breaking this rule because there's no room for J to go earlier than H, which means this doesn't work. We tried to make B false, and it didn't work. Guess what? That means that B must be true. If we can't make it false, that's another way of saying it must be true, which means B is the answer. So we're done the question. Let's go ahead and look at these other 3 answer choices. Even though we're done, let's just go ahead and see why they're wrong. So C says M is earlier than J, so can we make that false? The truth is, if you go ahead and rewind to number 18, let's trust that we got the right answer on number 18, that was D, we see that we made that false, right? It's always good to look at past scenarios. If you've ever made something false in the past, then you don't have to try it again. So in number 18D, I see that J is second and M is second to last. So J is before M, so we don't need to test C out because we've already made it false, right? C says M is earlier than J, but in 18 we put J earlier than M in the right answer. What about D? Does M have to be earlier than L? Well, let's see. We would go ahead and try to make D false. Does M have to be earlier than L? Let's try to put M later than L. Now, the truth is, if we want to just put M as late as possible, we might as well put M last. Because if we put M last, then we're not going to have to worry about triggering this rule, which means we're not going to have to worry about that. And M is not in any other rules. So all you have to do is just put M last, and then you don't have to worry about M. M will sort of play nice at that point. So let's go ahead and now just take care of all the other rules. We will put, let's see, let's not put J first, so we don't have to worry about that JK rule. Actually, who cares? We might as well just put J first and then just go ahead and take care of that. It doesn't really seem to matter. We could probably do this one of several ways. But let's see, now we know J has to be before H, and H and O have to be before P, which has to be before L. There were many ways we could have done this, but at any rate, by putting M last, right, we certainly put it later than lowball, which means we made D false. And then what about E? Does K have to be earlier than J? That certainly doesn't have to be true. That we just made false. Actually, pretty much every time we've made that false, right? We just put K later than J over there. We put K later than J there. We put K later than J there. Pretty much all the scenarios on the page, not pretty much, literally all the scenarios on the page, we have made E false, right? E says K is earlier than J. we put J earlier than K several times, which means E doesn't have to be true either. So that is how you prove that C, D, and E are not the answer. But anyway, we already had known that B was correct. Number 21. If Meanderers is the second movie released, which of the following must be true? So as always, we start off by making the if true and looking for inferences. So let's put M as the second movie. Let's look at the rules to see if we know anything else that has to be true. So for starters, are there any rules that have M in them? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. This last rule clearly has a couple of M's in it. So let's ask ourselves, is that rule telling us something here? If M is before P, then we know that something else is going to have to be true. So is M going to be before P in this scenario? Does P have to go into these last 5 spots? Well, what do we know about P? We know from another rule that P has to be after a couple of things. P has to be later than O and H, which means P's never going to be able to squeeze into that first spot, which means the answer is yes. P is going to have to be somewhere, we don't know exactly where yet, but certainly somewhere later than M in order to not break that other rule, which means that we know that no matter what, we are triggering this condition. M is going to be earlier than P, which means that that's going to give us a pretty valuable inference here. We're going to know that M is before J and J is before K. So somewhere later than that M, we know there's going to have to be a J, and then later than the J, there's going to be a K. That is a novel inference that we can infer here. So let's see. Do we know anything else? Now that we just put J and K down, do we know anything else about those letters? Well, let's see. J has to be earlier than H, right? We know because of this rule, J is before H, and we know from another rule that H is before P and P is before L. That's a lot of other letters we can add into this chain here. Now, we don't know where K factors in to that whole lineup, so we'll just add it as a separate chain. But we do know that J is before H, we know that H is before P, and we know that P is before L. So, in other words, in those 5 spots, we know that there's going to be a J, and somewhere later than the J, there's going to be a K, and also an H, and a P, and an L. Guess what? That's 5 letters, and we only have 5 spots, right? So this is very valuable because whenever you have a block of 5 letters that have to be inserted into a block of 5 spots, that means by process of elimination, whatever the only letter left is in this case, O, would have to go over here. That is a pretty valuable inference, as we're going to see in a second. That's literally the answer to the question. But we figure that out by determining that, even though we don't know exactly where some of these letters go, we know that we have 5 letters that have to all go later than M. And there's only 5 spots available later than M, which means that whatever's left, O in this case, has to go in that only one remaining spot earlier than M. Now, it happens to be, we would know for sure that since J is before all 4 of these other letters, K, H, P, and L, that J would have to go third. But then we wouldn't really know much else here because we know that the H has to be before the P has to be before the L, but the K can sort of be shuffled in anywhere later than that, seemingly. It doesn't really seem like it's going to come into conflict with any rules. So, at any rate, we did find 1 or 2 pretty substantial inferences here, so let's look through the answers to see if we have it, and as we alluded to a second ago, we do, right? Which of the following must be true? D, Ollie is released first. We just determined that, and therefore D is the answer. Let's go ahead and look at these other ones and see why they're not the answer. A, does H have to be 5th? As we can see, it doesn't. H could potentially be 4th here, right? And then we could go, let's say, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. K, P, L, we could have done that a few different ways. But we have certainly followed all of the rules, right? If you look at the rules, we haven't broken anything. What about B? Does K have to be 4th? We literally just violated that a second ago. We just made B false while we were making A false, so that worked out nicely. C, does low ball have to be 7th? We made low ball 7th, but we could easily switch that around. We could make it so that the K is 7th, and we put the H, P, L over there before the K. That seems to work, so we could make C false. And then, of course, E, we definitely have to make false. Periwinkle is definitely not 3rd because we have inferred that J has to be 3rd. So that's how you know that the other ones all can be false, which means they don't have to be true. But at any rate, we had already solved the question. Straight from the inferences, we knew that D was the one that had to be true. Let's look at number 22. If P is the 6th movie, then which of the following must be true? So as always, we start off by making the if true. We're going to make P the 6th movie. And before we go to the answer choices, we're going to look for inferences here. So There's a couple rules with P. First of all, we know that P has to be sandwiched in between OH on the left and L on the right. So that means that L is going to have no choice but to go last, right? And then OH are going to have to go somewhere in those first 5 spots. So we don't have to worry about breaking that rule because OH is anyway, wherever we put them, they're going to be somewhere before P. But the one thing we did have to worry about was making sure that L goes after P. And now that rule is taken care of. So what else do we know? Well, P's in another rule. This rule, which keeps coming back to haunt us, this conditional rule, which says that if M is before P, then M is going to be before J, and J is going to be before K. Have we triggered this rule? Well, even though we don't know where M is in number 22, wherever it goes, it's going to have to be somewhere before P, which means no matter what, we know that that rule is triggered, which means we have a pretty big amount of information. We know that somewhere in those first 5 spots, it's going to be M ... J ... K. Now, what else do we know that we could potentially add in here? Well, we know that J is before H, as per this rule, so we know that there's going to be an H somewhere after that J. What's the only letter missing is O. Does O have to go in any specific spot in this sequence? The answer seems to be no, because as long as we put O somewhere before P, which it will be no matter what, then we are fine. And that's pretty much all the rules. The only rule we haven't looked at yet is this one, but J is definitely not going to be first here because it has to be after something. So we're certainly not going to trigger that rule, so we're not going to have to worry about it. So this is all the inferences we have. Let's see. Which of the following must be true? Well, all of these answer choices involve sequence, involve one thing having to be earlier than another thing. And that is exactly what we figured out here. We figured out a bunch of ordering inferences. So let's see if we can find something that matches what we know. So A, does J have to be earlier than O? As we said, O seemingly can go anywhere, so that doesn't seem to be it. B, what about K and H? Seems like they both just have to go after J, so that doesn't seem to have to be true. What about C? M is earlier than H. That is something we've proven here because M is before J and J is before K and H, which means M would have to therefore be way earlier than H, which means C is the answer. C must be true. It's exactly part of the inferences that we found, so we know that C is the answer. We don't have to do anything else. That being said, just for practice, let's go through the other 4 answer choices and show that they don't have to be true. So we just kind of glanced through them and we found C just by eyeballing the inferences that we found here. But if we wanted to actually test these out, we can show that they don't have to be true. So A, does A have to be true or can it be false? The answer is we know it can be false. J doesn't have to be earlier than O because O could be anywhere. We could just put O first in order to violate A, right? We just made A false. A says J is earlier than O. We just put O earlier than J and everyone else for that matter. And that's going to be fine because then we can go M, J, and HK in either order. Doesn't really matter. So that's how we could make A false. B says K has to be earlier than H. We just made that false as well a second ago. We could have done it either way. So even if we did it the other way, we could just switch it around and we can show that B could be false as well. What about D? M is earlier than O. That we also made false because we put O first, right? What about E? O is earlier than H. That we made true, but we could have made false because we could have put O anywhere. Again, O could be at the very beginning of those 5. O could be at the very end of those 5. We could just go like this. M, J, doesn't really matter which one's first between K and H. And then O is 5th. And in this case, we violated E. We did not make O earlier than H. We made O later than H. So therefore, as you can see, A, B, D, and E are all eligible to be false, which means they are not the answer. They don't have to be true. C is the only one that has to be true, which we already know from looking at the inference from this question without actually testing anything out. So C is the right answer. All right, let's look at 23, final question. Which of the following cannot be true? So the way we test out cannot be true questions is we go through the answer choices, we try to make each one true, and we try to find the one that doesn't work. So A says K is later than M. Let's just write this out to be clear. K is later than M, but K is earlier than J. So before we try to put that onto the grid, let's see how it affects the rules. Let's look at how it affects the rules. So M, K, and J should maybe remind you of this last rule over here, right? And as you can see, we just made the end of that arrow false because the end of that arrow says M, then J, then K. This was M, then K, then J. which means the beginning of the arrow must be false as well, because that's how conditional logic works. We know that we can't trigger that rule because if we did, it would break it, which means M can't be before P, which means P has to be before M. So we have to put P before M. Now, what else do we know? If we look at J at the end of this chain, we have another rule that tells us that J has to be before H, which means we'll have to go J, then H. But then H has to be before P, and then L. This is a lot of letters in a row. And if you're paying attention, which hopefully you are, we already have something wrong here. P can't be twice. P can't be before M and also all the way later after H. So this is going to mess up the rules, right? So we don't even have to plot anything onto the grid here with A. Just from finding the sequencing chain here, we already have made it to a contradiction. There's no way that we can follow all the rules here. And again, just to review the logic here, that's because of the fact that M, K, J are in this sequence. That means that we can't trigger this rule. So M can't be before P, which means P has to be before M. The problem is P also, according to another rule, has to be much later because J is always before H and H is always before P. And since P can't be in two places at once, this is not going to work. A doesn't work, which means A is the answer. A cannot be true. That being said, just for practice, let's go ahead and go through these other answer choices and show why they are not the answer, show why they could be true. So we'll start with B. I will write it out down here first before we try to plot it on the grid. So M is later than J. M is later than J, but earlier than K. So once again, we have violated this rule. We made the end of the arrow false, which means that we have to violate the beginning of the rule as well. We have to make the beginning false, which means M can't be before P. M has to be after P. So we can throw P in as something that has to be earlier than M. Now let's go ahead and see if we can make this work. We know that O and H are always going to be before P, and we know that J is always going to be before H. So what if we started out with O? I'm going to try to plot this on the grid over here. What if we started off with O? The reason I started off with O as opposed to, let's say, J is because I don't want to have more things to worry about. If we start off with J, we have to worry about that rule. So let's say we go O and then J and then H. And that way we can then continue with this. We can continue with the P, because the P has to be after the H according to the rules, right? So let's say we then did the P. What are we missing? M, K. Now we have made sure that the P is before the M, so we're not going to have to worry about that rule, right? As we have discussed. And we have to put M and K at the end. What else are we missing? We are also missing, let's see, what are we missing? We have M, K, and what's left? L, right? And L can seemingly go anywhere as long as it's after P. It doesn't really matter. So whatever. M, K, L. O, J, H, P, M, K, L seems to work. Let's go through the rules. We didn't trigger this conditional rule, so that's fine. We didn't trigger this conditional rule, so that's also fine. And as far as the other rules, they're both followed. J is before H, and OH is before P, which is before L. So therefore, even though that kind of took a second, we managed to test out B. This is B, and we made it true, which means it's not the answer. What about C? M is later than O. C, M is later than O, but earlier than J. So O and then M and then J. Well, guess what? Good news. Our eyes are open and on the page, and we can see that we've already done that. We've already done that in number 21, and therefore that clearly can be true, so there's no need to test that out from scratch. That works for sure, right? There's no need to make something true if you've already made it true in a past question. What about D? D says M is later than H. M is later than H, but M is earlier than low ball, so HML. Guess what? Good news again. We just did that a minute ago. We have H and then M and then L in that sequence, which means we've already made D true, so it's not the answer. What about E? Finally, O is later than M. So O is later than M, but O is earlier than H. So have we ever done that before where we have M and then O and then H? The answer seems to be yes. We did that over here, and that seems to be the only time, but As long as we've done it once, then that's good enough. We know that it can be true, which means it's not the answer to a question that says which of the following cannot be true. And that is how you would do number 23. Again, we didn't have to do any of this because we already knew that the answer was A just from putting A on the page, looking for what else would have to be true, right? We did the sequencing chain over here and we found that it already didn't work before we even put it onto the grid. Therefore, A was the answer to 23.
If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.